people are using it. This is definitely taking place in the Uruk, and we're going to see some Uruk pottery a little bit later. The city of Uruk itself is associated with Gilgamesh and the Epic of Gilgamesh, this legendary hero who, in conjunction with his consort Enkidu, built the walls of Uruk and the ramparts and built temples to Anu and Inanna. It's very interesting because this Sumerian epic, the story of Gilgamesh, has some basis in archaeological fact. We do have at the site a temple of Anu and a temple of Inanna at this very early period. And actually, there were a few artifacts that were discovered associated with a guy named Imberagarsi of Kish, who's mentioned in these legends as one of Gilgamesh's adversaries. And so he's actually a historical figure that we have outside of just the mythic narrative. So there might be some basis in fact for the existence of a king named Gilgamesh. Now, whether or not he actually slayed the bull of heaven and all that, as we'll see in the myth a little bit later, that remains to be seen, obviously. The origins of the city are also discussed in Sumerian epic poetry. By Sumerian, Sumer is the name given to this region a little bit later on. It means the land of the rightly guided kings, or the homeland. But Uruk has a very special place in the history of the city and in the Sumerian mindset. It goes hand in hand with the emergence of the civilization, And in Sumerian mythology, it's said that the god Enlil, who is sort of the head of the pantheon, collected all of the attributes of civilization together. And these attributes are known kind of collectively as Mays. Well, I won't write it down, but a May is just it's M-E, and it's an attribute of civilization, say architecture, things like that. So he collects them all together and entrusts them to the god Enki. And we've actually encountered Enki before. Where's Enki's temple? Anybody remember? Yeah. Eridu. At Eridu, right? So Enki is the city god of Eridu. All of these cities are going to have specific gods associated with them eventually. And Enki is a god of wisdom. So Enlil entrusts Enki with all of these attributes of civilization. We're told that Inanna, who is a version of the goddess Ishtar, she's a goddess of love, a goddess of war, and she's also the goddess of the city of Uruk, one of the gods there. The other is Anu, who's a sky god. And we're told in mythology that Inanna, in a bid to glorify her city and to become a greater goddess, ends up tricking Enki into giving her some of these Mays, these attributes of civilization. So I'll read you some of the myth right now. So on that day, the maiden Inanna, holy Inanna, directed her steps all by herself towards Enki's temple in Eridu. On that day, he of exceptional knowledge, who knows the divine powers in heaven and earth, who from his own dwelling already knows the intentions of the gods, Enki, the king of the temple, who before holy Inanna had approached within 6 miles, already knew her purpose. Enki spoke to his servant and gave him instructions. Come here, my man, listen to my words. You are to welcome holy Inanna at this holy table and at the table of An. After Enki had spoken to him thus, the minister followed his master's instructions closely. He led Inanna to the temple and into Eridu. He led Inanna, and when she entered, gave her butter cake to eat. They poured cool and refreshing water for her, and they gave her beer to drink in front of the lion's gate. He made her feel as though she was in the house of a friend and a colleague. He welcomed her to the site and to the temple of An. And so it came that Enki and Inanna were drinking beer together in the temple and enjoying the taste of sweet wine. The bronze aga vessels were filled to the brim, and the two of them started a competition, drinking from the bronze vessels. And unfortunately, at this point, this is where the narrative ends, right when it gets interesting. But what we're told is that Inanna gets Enki drunk. She gets him completely drunk, and when the text picks up again in segment D, we actually see a drunk Enki starting to hand out all the maize, all the attributes of civilization, saying, "I'll give these to my holy daughter Inanna." And Inanna received heroism, power, wickedness, righteousness, the plundering of cities, the making of lamentations, rejoicing. She received deceit, the rebel lands, kindness, being on the move and being sedentary. She received the craft of the carpenter, the craft of the coppersmith, craft of the scribe, craft of the smith, craft of the leather worker, the fuller. And you can see where this is going, right? She's receiving wisdom, attentiveness, holy purification, all these attributes of civilization, everything that comes with a sedentary lifestyle and life in a city, crafts. And there are over 100 of these maize. They include things like the institution of the temple, rulership, architecture, animal husbandry, even things like prostitution and procreation. But if you listen to that list closely, it's not just the good things that are coming from civilization too. It's all of those bad things that come, things like terror, weapons, lamentation, the destruction of cities. So in a lot of ways, this is like a Pandora's box that's being opened, only with just as many good things as bad things. These maize take physical form. Inanna is able to actually bring them back and show them to the people of Uruk. And most important among them is the ability to decide, the ability of decision-making or judgment. And this becomes critical for later kingship, our sense of kingship. You need individuals who can decide and rule. And this story is very interesting for a number of reasons. It defines a very clear concept of what civilization means for early Sumerian culture. And it's a concept that separates them in their own mind from other people who are uncivilized. The myth also symbolizes the passing of power from Eridu to Uruk. You can see, of course, right, Enki giving these things to Inanna, who's sort of succeeding him. And it shows an attitude towards the nature of the gods during this time, right? These are gods who have to be tricked. Very similar to the story of Prometheus stealing fire. These are gods who are capricious, gods who don't necessarily have our best interests in mind, and gods that really need to be placated. So what we're seeing is actually the beginnings of a system. Let me get a piece of chalk here. In which humanity is entering into a productive relationship with the gods. We've got our gods who control nature, which sustains humanity, who in turn, right, have to build temples and worship the gods. So we're entering into this very productive cycle, which is meant to ensure not just our well-being, but the well-being of this entire system. And at the core of this, the human whose role it is to make sure that at least this branch is taken care of, is a figure known as the En. And the En is sort of a divine priest king. It's a term that shows up in early Sumerian, and it's kind of, for lack of a better word, a big man who has secular and religious authority. We'll be encountering the En at a little bit later as well. But before we do, let's go back to Uruk itself. Uruk was excavated. Two main areas have been excavated: the Eanna precinct and the Anu precinct. Right, these two gods, probably hearkening back to a time when Uruk was actually these two cities. The entire site, as you can see here, is incredibly complex. It exhibits a deliberate planning and suggests a very well-defined use, probably a sacred precinct. Both areas are primarily religious, and these temples are not just places of worship and edifices to the gods, but they're also institutions and estates. They're instrumental in the organization of society, and this is where the En would sort of hold court. Also, temples act to centralize and redistribute goods, as we saw at Tepe Gawra, right, where one of the temples was filled with these stamp ceilings. Goods are coming and going, and so they serve a secular purpose as well. So we're looking at the what's known as the Inanna precinct, meaning that the house of heaven dedicated to our goddess Inanna, and this is kind of a mess. In Rofe, this is actually mislabeled. I don't know why, something with the color scheme is kind of messed up, but I've corrected it here. The blue buildings date to level 4B, which is actually an earlier level than level 4A, which comes after it, right? It's built on top, which is this tan color right here. And you can see a tremendous amount of rebuilding and a number of things taking place. So we're going to start with level 4B, and all of this dates, again, to the late Uruk period. We have substantial remains during this time, level 4B. We see, first of all, the construction of a very interesting temple. It's known as the limestone temple. And you can see it has those attributes of earlier temples that we've seen, the niching on the outside, it's tripartite, but it's introducing this very interesting sort of cruciform T shape, and also has its corners oriented towards the points of the compass. This thing is massive. It's huge. It's 70 meters by 30 meters wide. The roof was probably covered with timber, and it's called the limestone temple because it's built with limestone foundations, and the outside of the temple is actually decorated in limestone. I'll go back to the board here. When you're building a temple or a building for that matter, you often have to use something very solid for the foundation. So what you'll do is you will actually dig a ditch in the where you want your wall to be. This is sort of a cutaway view, and you'll lay in something very solid, stone, for example, or baked mud brick later on, as we'll see. Maybe your first course of that wall will also be stone. And what this provides you with is a solid foundation upon which to build. If you just sort of lay mud brick on top of the soil, your building's going to collapse. It's not going to be strong. You need a strong and solid foundation upon which then you start building a mud brick superstructure. Does that make sense? Now, when these buildings are collapsed, as we're going to see, as we saw earlier, with building and temple on top of temple on top of temple, many times these walls are destroyed. They just get tipped over. But the foundations survive. So that's how we're able to reconstruct these earlier temples and get a sense of how this complex changed over time. So the limestone temple is interesting for a number of reasons we talked about. To the south, we see what's called the Mosaic Court and Pillar Hall. And this is a interesting enclosed temple complex. And what's very unique about it is it's actually decorated with these terracotta cones. You can see them here. I'm just going to jump forward a little bit. These terracotta cones, which have been dipped in different colors on one end and then stuck into mud to create these amazing geometric patterns of lozenges and zigzags, an incredibly involved process. And these were massive too. The portico is 30 meters wide. These 8 circular columns and then these 4 engaged columns are actually 2.6 meters wide. So this is a very, very, very large complex and would have been a significant amount of effort being put into it. The patterns might relate to patterns that we would see in textiles, which could have been used to decorate earlier temples. Of course, they don't survive if they do. But it's a very, very interesting development. Bricks during this period, I should also say, the building materials that lie at the core of these temples, mud bricks, they're known as rimchin bricks. And all that means is it's a brick which has a section that's perfectly square. So we imagine like a modern brick, right, which is long and it's a little bit flat and a little bit